Okay, good morning. How is everyone? Welcome back to class. So today we're going to look at Rousseau's second discourse. This is called the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. Rousseau's simple goal, he's living in the 18th century. He's a Swiss-born, but living a good bit of his life in France. And his goal was to explain the origins historically of the inequality in particular that he saw before him in his own day in 18th century France and more generally in 18th century Europe. 18th century Europe was the age of absolute monarchy. It was the age of noble privilege, a distinction between aristocracy and nobility on the one hand, and peasantry, serfdom, and the commoner on the other one. And the inequalities were rife, obvious, apparent. In particular, the inequalities were not just economic, they were political, they were legal, and they were economic property-based, and also disparities of recognition. And this is something that Rousseau, in his psychological explanation of the origins of inequality, is going to focus on the theme of two themes, really, self-love and recognition. When Rousseau tries to explain the origins of inequality, he does some things very interesting. The first thing he does is that he tells a narrative account. He gives the explanation of the origin of inequality as a historical explanation of the development of human civilization up to his own day. What is the cause of inequality? In the general sense of what kind of thing caused it, not even the specifics. He will say in other texts, and it's inherent in this text, this notion of primitive man or savage man or uncivilized man in the state of nature, explicitly calls it a state of nature, that the origins of inequality are not in the nature of man. Human beings by nature are equal. And essentially he says equal in power and equal in desires, and he makes a very similar claim to Hobbes. And he explicitly talks about the faculties or powers of men, intellectually, a body and mind, right, to achieve their goals, and the fact that since they're all equal, nobody in the state of nature, nobody dominates one another. What is the most fascinating element of his explanation of the origins of inequality is that his analysis of the cause, he cites a psychological cause, a psychological transformation of the human species. The origin is in the transformation of self-love, this basic kind of self-interested attitude of our primary concern for ourselves. Therefore, what's fascinating is this entire explanation of inequality. Now think about it. One of the main inequalities he's concerned to talk about is inequalities of property, which are reinforced and established by political institutions. All political theorists say, in effect, that if there is no political authority, there is no property, because there's nobody there to enforce property rights. So therefore, almost every political thinker has seen property and property rights as a product of political institutions. Therefore, the economic disparities of property and of ownership are naturally tied to disparities of political power and authority, right? What's interesting, let's just compare to Marx. Marx basically says in his writings, the Communist Manifesto and others, that the origins of political inequality are based in economic inequality, and that the political inequality then helps to reinforce and maintain the economic inequality. And when we're talking about economic inequality, we're talking about normally two things, like who has what and how much, and then do the rules provide people for having things at all? If we think of the distinction between a master and a slave, a master is one who by definition is able to own property, and not only own property in land and wealth and so on, but own property in people, right? Whereas the slave, not only can they not own property for the most part, but they're not even property. They're not even in control of their own bodies. Their body is not even their property, right? What's so fascinating about Rousseau, and as far as I know, there is no other thinker who took quite such a clear and decisive psychological analysis of the origins of inequality, but that he posits that the origins of inequality are a psychic phenomena, a phenomena of the human soul, a phenomena of human psychology. And from that psychic origin, some kind of transformation in the human soul, from the psychic origin, then results economic inequality, then results political inequality, then from that psychic spring results legal inequality. That is really a fascinating explanation. That is one of the reasons why we're reading this text. And we're going to see many things that are going to dovetail from Book 9 of Aristotle's Ethics, this issue of self-love, because we'll talk about it in a minute. At the center of Rousseau's explanation of the origins of inequality is our transformation in this self-love from what he calls amour de soi-même to amour propre. Amour de soi-même to amour propre. And these are two terms that are translated throughout the text for the most part. But on page 218, he gives a very explicit definition of these terms. And he gives the translator and editor gives the original French so we can see clearly which one means what. And of course, the irony is that on the most literal level, both of these terms actually mean self-love, but they mean a very different type of self-love, one good and one bad, one natural and one conventional. And we see a lot of echoes of Aristotle's two conceptions of self-love. There's like the self-lover who's the narcissist, who actually is flawed and regretful and guilty, and they love themselves as a kind of concealment of acknowledgement of their guilt. They don't want to look at themselves and what they really are because they know what they've done is wrong, whatever it is in their lives. Let's take as an example the murderer that Arendt talks about. And then for Aristotle, there's the good form of self-love that means you've been a virtuous person. You've lived in a life guided by the compass of reason, and that's led you to virtuous actions, and that means you have a sense of self-contentment because you know you've done the right things in light of what you are as a human being, a rational animal who because as an animal you have reason, therefore that is the primary thing you should be guided by in your life. Rousseau has some very important similarities with Aristotle in these two explanations of two different types of self-love, but he also has some very important differences. The first thing we should say is that Rousseau does not see inequality as a natural product of human nature. Human beings, by nature, are naturally not unequal. To flip that around, instead of the double negative, human beings are by nature equal, right? And he posits something else. Not so clearly in this text, but in other texts that really dovetail with it. He says that man is born good and is corrupted in society. Human nature is naturally good. And this story that he tells about what's called the natural goodness of man or of human nature is a kind of retelling. What we really have here in this story, this historical narrative, and I kind of stress that it's a story because he tells it as a story, and he calls it like a hypothetical history because he has to talk about pre-civilized man all the way up to the 18th century. And while it was the case that in the 18th century the social sciences were developing, anthropology was developing, kind of the comparative study of civilizations and cultures was developing. The West became increasingly curious about non-Western cultures and understood their different stages of development and their different customs and why that might be the case. Rousseau doesn't have all the facts at his disposal. He is a philosopher and a writer, a moral political thinker, And he talks about writing a conjectural or hypothetical history because he's dealing with such a swath, such a great breadth of facts that he knows he can't have every one of them exactly perfectly right. But he's saying, in effect, that at a certain stage of history, something like this must have happened that culminated in the way we are today, right? And in essence, he writes a naturalistic version of the Genesis story. Man was not originally born sinful. Man was born good. And it was society that corrupted humankind. Society that corrupted humankind. Now, you're immediately in a chicken and egg discussion there. If man is born good, how is it that society can ever corrupt mankind? Right? Society is just human nature writ large and a collective rather than individual. So this is an interesting question for Rousseau. But Rousseau's answer to that question and the more general question of what causes the corruption, given that human nature is naturally good, this is very fascinating. His answer is historical circumstance. Something happened in the historical circumstances of human beings as they developed, as they evolved, such that they were brought together in a way, circumstances, external conditions of life, brought them together in a way that brought out corrupting elements in nature and ultimately inequality, which he sees as conventional, not natural. Likewise, the corruption of the human soul and of human society that brings about unhappiness is a result of that which is by convention, rather than that which is by nature. And therefore, when we look at these two factors, amour de soi-même and amour propre, the good form of self-love and the bad form of self-love, one will be considered natural, which is to say intrinsic to the human being biologically, and the other one is going to be seen as a contrivance of culture, which is to say all those things that are passed down from one generation to the next that are not given to us by our genes alone, but by some type of moral education, some type of indoctrination, and so on. So the first thing we should say about this explanation is it's actually one we're all very familiar with today in the 21st century, and it tends to be actually the way we look at human beings much more than the way Aristotle envisioned them. Which is to say, when we see someone suffering, or when we see someone who's poor, or when we see someone who's behind bars, we tend, at least generally as a community, as a nation, as a society, we tend not to say, oh, it's on them. They failed. They had a failure of reason. They had a failure of virtue. They had weakness of will, and they couldn't get their lives together. Instead, we say, no. If you, we say, if you had grown up in that neighborhood with that life, with a broken home or with a police department that really wasn't looking out for the well-being of its citizens, racist, structural racism, and any number of factors, structural poverty connected with racism, we would say, no, you who have grown up and gone to college, you would have ended up just like that person. Because it's not about you and your individual nature, it's about the circumstances being so challenging that regardless of your nature, it's virtually impossible to overcome them, or it's almost impossible. So we attribute the failures of human beings to their circumstances rather than to their own agency. Now, this was a radical argument made by Rousseau, and it's very unique, and it's interesting because today we take this kind of argument for granted. Furthermore, so if you think of before Rousseau, people's actions, people's deeds, people's failures were on them, right? I mean, that was just the standard outlook, particularly with morality. If people are going to have moral responsibility, you have to make them accountable for their own actions. You have to say that they are the makers of their own destiny. Otherwise, you're displacing their own responsibility for their lives. And you can see that's a fairly reasonable argument. The other thing he did was overturn thousands and thousands of years of political and moral thinking, moral thought, that it was obvious that there was something intrinsically flawed in human nature, that there were intrinsic evils, And we might not use the word evil, we might not use the expression original sin, but it all amounts to about the same thing. The basic thinking from the Bible forward, and even before the Bible, is that human beings have desires that by their very nature are threatening and potentially harmful, or are harmful to other people and the collective good, the common interest, the public good. And since human beings have these desires that could harm themselves, harm other people, and harm the common good, that therefore they need to be restrained, and we need to acknowledge up front the evil or the fallenness of human nature. You might not use the word evil, that might be too strong, but the acknowledgement that people can do wrong in a way that harms others, and that this is natural, was taken for granted by thousands of years of moral thought. And Rousseau is really the first person to displace the blame from human beings and their nature to their circumstances, their historical circumstances. So then we get to the question of, what was the cause of this transformation? If man came from the author, came from the creator, came from nature good, and was corrupted in society, but his nature is good, and society is really just our nature writ large in society. If we have flaws as individuals, as a group, they're just going to be amplified. What was the transformation that corrupted us? And I'm not going to give you the full answer, but he has a beautiful, beautiful expression. And that expression is a fortuitous concatenation of several circumstances or several external causes. What is a fortuitous concatenation of several external causes? So notice external causes or circumstances, which are really just external causes. And he uses this expression at least 3 times in the text, or variations of it. Whatever it means this. It means things that were circumstantial, external to human beings, outside of our control, not part of our internal nature. They impinged on our nature and affected our nature. Right? And this story that he's telling comes at a time where Europeans were becoming increasingly concerned to understand other cultures, right? The first civilization to actually take seriously the study of other cultures and treating them with dignity and respect actually started in Western Europe. Western Europe, which is typically seen as Eurocentric, ethnocentric, bigoted, colonialist, imperialist power, and on and on and on. The tyranny of reason and all this gobbledygook. It was Western civilization, and it was a result of their own values and their own, what they saw as intellectual virtues that inspired them to want to study seriously and understand seriously other civilizations, and not just write them off as different and therefore foreign and a threat and all the kind of bigoted xenophobia that, type of name calling that's thrown out today in our politics. The answer they came to, in many cases, at least certain theorists, not all, was that it wasn't that humans across the world were fundamentally different in their nature. In fact, they were basically the same. But rather it was their circumstances of climate, of resources, of geography, just the opportunities they had to live a certain way that pushed them in a certain direction. And in fact, if you could understand the circumstances under which people lived, you'd start to understand why they had different moral codes than you did, why their community was formed around a different understanding of its telos, its happiness. So this all comes back to what word? We'll go forward just now. It comes back to what word? What is Rousseau really concerned with? Da-da-da-da-da-da. Rousseau is concerned with human happiness. Full stop. He is therefore, I think primarily, I would consider him a kind of ethicist or moralist. He wrote political philosophy. He wrote, this is a kind of hypothetical history or conjectural history. He wrote novels. but his sole concern is human happiness, right? And he therefore has the exact same concern as Aristotle, but he sees human happiness and the problems faced that threaten human happiness in a very different way than Aristotle does, right? What's the problem of the corruption of the human species and the human soul from a good state to a bad state, from an uncivilized state to a civilized state? It destroys our happiness and makes us miserable, right? So that is the central concern he has. And to come back to our class, how does it all tie together? He actually says that it is civilization that has not brought about progress and happiness, but precisely the development of civilization, the arts and sciences, the development of urban life, the agricultural revolution, the development of metallurgy and war. It's actually all these key advances. They're advances on one hand, like the development of agriculture. It's clearly an advance on one hand, but he says they're also setbacks to the moral and psychic life of human beings, and they have actually created a tremendous amount of misery, and they've created more misery than they've alleviated. Now, this is a radical claim, particularly in the age that he's making it. The second discourse is written, I think I've got it here somewhere, 1755. This is in the midst, 1755, of what's called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was determined to apply reason and the arts and sciences and technology to liberate man from past injustice, from past ignorance, from past superstition, from past social organization, past moral, unjust moral conceptions of the world, and bring the light of reason into all aspects of society and make it better. And therefore it would progress, not just technologically or artistically, but morally, right? Which is say more happiness and living at, you could say, a higher level of humanity. Okay, so I've broken this lecture into two parts. The first part of this story really gets at this theme of the corruption of the human species and exactly what is the distinction between this natural man and the civilized man. So you notice that the discourses is broken up into two parts. There's a part one and a part two, right? Part one really lays the stage for part two, and part two is like really the meat and potatoes of it all. But part one establishes his portrait of man. His portrait of mankind or human nature in the state of nature, and also an idea of what it's going to look like in civil society as it's corrupted, right? So it's a fairly dark image, right? Part two really gives us his understanding of the decisive moments of our corruption, and it all has to do with the development of our social interactions. And it's really fascinating because he understands, as I said, this history is really a psychological history. He understands all these social interactions as really transformations or causing a transformation in our psychology. And in particular, us thinking in a different way about our own self-love, and more specifically, a transformation of our passion of love, plain and simple. You might even say a transformation in the passion of eros, right? The theme we've been talking about in the symposium. So everything we've been talking about here is going to come full circle, and now we're going to look at it in this collective way. So let's just hit some of these points here. Rousseau is fundamentally concerned with human happiness. Human nature, in its essence, its natural state, is naturally good, equal, peaceful, and happy. It's kind of, you might say, utopian. And the picture, by the end of the second discourse, we're marching on a trajectory here throughout the discourse, from the beginning, from pre-civilized man to civilized man, and it culminates in his own century, the 18th century. And if the beginning is a kind of utopian vision, the image of the 18th century is a kind of dystopian image. Inequality is the source of our unhappiness, and it is the product of civil society. In the second discourse, he's determined to explain the origin of inequality by telling a history or a story, a narrative account of the development of human civilization. At the center of the transformation of human nature and human society is a transformation of self-love, love and self-love, from a natural and peaceful sentiment to a conventional and destructive sentiment. So a natural sentiment is one that we're born with, and a conventional sentiment is the one that's a result of conventions of society, habituation, training, education. We're not born with it. Rousseau's, I'm saying this only slightly facetiously, Rousseau's history is really a love story. And it's not obvious at the beginning, but this story is really about how love, the passion, and here we're just talking about passion, right? The passion of love and desire, and obviously first and foremost for another person, but it will ramify out into other types of desires. Exponentially almost, or infinitely, or without limit, indefinitely. This is really a story about the transformation of human love, starting from the basic impulse to self-preservation and survival, to sexual desire, and then to something that, as it enters society, it gets clothed in all types of fascinating concepts and what he calls ideas of merit and beauty, something we'll talk about more. Perhaps one of the most radical claims is that human nature is about human nature. He says man is not the rational animal. This is huge. Man is the being or animal of feeling or sentiment. So the word that's used in the text, and the French word is sentiment, les sentiments, the sentiments. When he says the sentiments, he's talking about feelings, emotions, or what the Greeks would have used the word passions. In the soul, right? We've seen Aristotle. There's a war going on between reason and passion, right? And for Aristotle, it's very simple. For human beings to be happy, reason must rule in the soul. It must regulate the passions accordingly, based on what's appropriate to achieve virtue. The passions are not intrinsically bad. They're just blind, and they need the assistance of reason. Rousseau rejects this idea almost completely. I think he's a little more subtle than that. There's few more things going on. If you ever really get into reading Rousseau, you realize it's not quite this simple. But for our purposes, it is understandable why we're going to take away this bumper sticker here, which is that for Rousseau, the human being is primarily a being of sentiment. And Rousseau is responsible for the Romantic Revolution. And the Romantic Revolution, in a sense, was the rejection, in a way, of the Enlightenment, or a partial rejection of the Enlightenment, focusing on not reason, but emotion as central to human life. Why does it matter? Why does emotion versus reason matter so much? Aristotle makes it very simple. Reason is the guide. It is the compass for human life to achieve happiness. Rousseau flips that on its head. He says, wrong, wrong. We didn't survive for all those tens of thousands of years before we had all these fancy concepts, before we had philosophers. We didn't survive on reasoning about what the right thing to do is. We had instincts, and instincts are just a version of emotion, passion, impulse. And those, he says, effectively, those impulses served us very well. We didn't need to formulate the golden rule of moral conduct. We didn't need to have ethicists like Aristotle sit down and explain to us how we were to live, doing a complete rational analysis of, what is virtue and what is happiness. We just needed to follow our hearts. We needed to follow our hearts, right? This is a powerful argument. He says that the moral compass of man is not reason, it is passion. And when we're talking about moral compass, we're just talking about right and wrong. And in the schematics of it, without getting into specifics, doing right is going to bring happiness and doing wrong is going to bring unhappiness, right? In the abstract. Therefore, sentiments should be the guide for our lives. And he makes it clear, and in this Aristotle wouldn't disagree with, that sentiments are the things that drive us most of the time. The problem is, it's not that in modernity we're any less driven by our sentiments or our passions. It's that they are distorted or crippled by the dictates of society and by the standards and expectations, by the education of society, by what society holds up as important. Right? So this is a revolution within the philosophy. I mean, if we consider Rousseau a philosopher, which, you know, it's how he's been understood in the last 300 years. For a philosopher to advocate for the sentiments over reason is a really radical thing to do, and it really radically altered the whole course of philosophy up through the 21st century in many ways. So to get a little context here, the second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality, second discourse is a shorthand, written in 1755, it came after the first discourse. And the reason why they're described as the first and second discourses is because they're related to one another. They were the result of two essay contests in which there was a question proposed by the Academy of Dijon. It's kind of like a call for papers. We need to publish papers, and here's a topic people can write on. And the two questions and their answers go hand in hand, and they really form a larger whole, which is why they're described as the first and second. So in 1750, the Academy of Dijon asked this question for people to respond to. Has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? Has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? Okay, so this is a question being asked in the context of the Enlightenment, in which reason is going to be used to develop the sciences and arts. When they talk about the restoration, I think what they're really referring to is the Renaissance, starting in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, 14th, 15th century, depending on who you talk to, that really brought a rebirth of ancient Greece and Rome, right? In terms of their scientific exploration of the world and inquiring in the world through the use of reason and evidence, and an awareness of our own ignorance of what we don't know. You can't go seeking for knowledge except under the assumption that there are things that you don't know out in the world that you may learn and gain knowledge of. If you think you know everything, there is no point to go out your front door and try to learn anything new. So, the restorations of the arts and sciences, it's not really an expression. We still have things like the College of Arts and Sciences. What are we really talking about? We're talking about the arts, first of all, literature, drama, poetry, the novel, letters in general, rhetoric. And then we're talking about the sciences, like the whole breadth of them, from like physics, Newtonian physics. Of course, Newton comes along in the 17th, early 18th century and transforms the discipline of physics. So literature, science, and technology, and the industry that is the product of it. So one thing the Enlightenment was very concerned with was developing a notion that scientific truths that would be discovered through the result of the scientific method could then be applied practically for the benefit of the society at large. So what does this question really mean? The question really was, in our own language, have the recent developments in literature, science, technology, and industry led to the moral progress of civilization in Europe, purification of morals, the moral progress of civilization? Now, Rousseau was connected in with many famous thinkers, people like Baron d'Holbach, David Hume, and in particular Voltaire. Voltaire being the most prominent, most public figure of the French Enlightenment in the middle of the 18th century. And Voltaire, who had been Rousseau's profound friend, Denis Diderot is another name, all friends, a small world, they all would have answered unequivocally yes. That all these things that they're basically talking about, has the Enlightenment resulted in progress, right? And when we think about progress, what are we really talking about? Are we just talking about technology? Or are we talking about a better life for human beings, a more civilized, a more humane, a more moral society? When we talk about progress, that's really what we want. Progress is not just about air conditioning and video games and text messaging and Zoom meetings. Progress is really about the happiness of the human species, right? Which means moral betterment. All of his friends, all of Rousseau's friends like Voltaire would have answered unequivocally yes. How does Rousseau answer? He says no. This, my friends, is, I don't want to say it's crazy, but Rousseau in his own day, today he's not a right-wing thinker. In fact, he's more left-wing than he is right-wing, if we're going to politically align him. But he was so out of step with his own time that he would be like the alt-right conspiracy theorist of his day for saying no. I mean, this was sacrilegious to the movement of the Enlightenment, which was a propagandistic endeavor of kind of public promotion of these ideas, and he just put a big monkey wrench in it. Not only does he answer no, he says all this technology, the sciences, and the arts actually do what? They further not liberate us and lead us to our happiness, but they only give the powers that be, the throne and the altar, the church and the state, more power to enslave us. Right? We're already, in answering this question as no, on our way to the threat and the hinting at a new type of tyrannical society that doesn't just have a tyrant like Thrasymachus as its leader, but that uses science and technology to control its people. And the name for that is an authoritarian government, but more specifically, the word that was invented in the 20th century for this is a totalitarian government. Rousseau, think about it. What did Francis Bacon say science was? Science gives you knowledge. What did Francis Bacon, the first, major scientist of the scientific revolution, he said very simply, knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. Well, think about it. Who's going to have the knowledge and the power that is science? It's the people in charge. So what you're really doing when you unleash the sciences is you're not just talking about a disinterested pursuit of knowledge. You're talking about the rulers finding scientific techniques to gain greater control over people. And this is the 18th century. You think of how primitive they are at that stage scientifically. And they were not that primitive. Just by our standards, we blow them out of the water because so much happened toward the end of the 19th and in through the 20th century. It just transformed technological power in ways human beings only 100 years prior never could have even fathomed. Right? So the point is, Rousseau is really one of the first people to see the way in which the modern unleashing of science could actually result not in the liberation and progress of human beings, but could result in their kind of perpetual enslavement. And I emphasize all this because when we look at 1984, that is exactly what we have in a book that's written in 1948, 49, right after World War II, 200, almost 200 years later. 200 years later. Okay. So we have to understand that Rousseau occupies one of the most unusual positions in terms of the Enlightenment. He is typically considered an Enlightenment thinker. He was certainly sympathetic to many of their causes, many of their general attitudes. But it's almost like he took the Enlightenment and took it to the 2.0 level and was the first Enlightenment thinker actually to apply reason to the Enlightenment itself and raise some of these profound concerns. And I think history, in the 2 world wars, in the atomic bomb, in viruses being developed in labs throughout the world, and so on and so forth, in the technology that could surveil the whole globe, I think Rousseau has been borne out to be more than correct. And in fact, his analysis of the threat that comes from technology is really as old as the Bible and Greek myth itself. If you think of the story of Prometheus, you think of the story of